just have two questions for all of you. One, what are you doing here on this beautiful April afternoon? And two, how much do I owe you for showing up? So I'm really happy to be here with you. It's been kind of a whirlwind the last couple weeks and months. We've had so many things going on at VSB, and then to win this award has really, meant a great deal to me. And mostly it's meant a great deal because it has allowed me to continue to interact with all of you, with Amanda and others on sort of a different level or a different fashion, if you will. So I was thinking about what I might present today, not really knowing what the composition of the crowd would be, or even if there would be a crowd. And so what I decided to do is really to present a paper that falls into the category of what we would call theory development with some applications. So much of my research is typical macro level, sort of large N research with a lot of numbers and a lot of asterisks next to those numbers. And something told me that wasn't really what you were going to be in the mood for this afternoon. So instead, I'm going to present a paper that's really about ideas that are based on theory, that are based on literature, and I'm going to show you how these ideas might apply in practice, but I'm not going to throw a lot of data and numbers at you. So again, not knowing who might decide to show up this afternoon, I thought I might begin by just telling you a little bit about my own research, but also kind of business school research generally. And for those of you who are not coming from VSB, you may be surprised to learn that we consider ourselves as social scientists or social and behavioral scientists. So many of the same kind of rubrics and methods and approaches that you use in economics and political science and anthropology and sociology, roughly mirror the kinds of ways that we approach the problems that we look at. Now, it is true that the focus of our activity and our attention does tend to be on business organizations or industries or individuals, but we don't necessarily restrict that focus only to business organizations. And you'll see here in a moment, I have spent quite a lot of time thinking about non-governmental organizations, so organizations that are not-for-profits, that do not fall into that for-profit category. So again, for VSB colleagues, this will be no surprise, but just to give you a little sense of sort of how I characterize myself and where I'm situated in terms of sort of research domains, or what we might call disciplines, I would say that my research is really at the intersection of strategic management, of international management, and of social issues management, what sometimes we also call corporate social responsibility or sustainability. And so within those three spheres, if you will, I've tackled different topics or different problems. So when I was in my doctoral program, I looked primarily at privatization, so the movement of public sector enterprises to the private sector and some of the challenges and difficulties and impacts of that process, mostly in emerging economies. And a good amount of my research has been directed in the developing and emerging world as opposed to the advanced industrialized countries, because frankly, that's where a lot of the business and economic activity has been over the last 10 or 20 years. So some of the other topics I've looked at are offshore outsourcing, what we sometimes call non-market strategy, which are the strategic initiatives that firms take in the political or social realm. So in the political realm, things like lobbying, PAC contributions, whatever. As you'll see here in a moment, in the social realm, working alongside non-governmental organizations or not-for-profits to accomplish often social and economic objectives. So CSR strategy kind of falls into there. I've looked at corruption, not participated directly in corruption. This was not primary research, but I do have a stream of research that looks at corruption. And if I were to say, what is kind of the common thread here? What is the one thing that kind of ties this together? I would say global corporate responsibility. Global corporate responsibility can be found somewhere in all of these topics and issues that I've tackled. And in particular, I've been interested in what is sometimes termed cross-sectoral collaboration or cross-sectoral partnerships, or what was called back in the 70s and 80s, public-private partnerships, different types of collaboration between and among organizations from different sectors. And I think of three sectors as the kind of defining primarily our social and economic life. So public sector, government, private sector business, and then not-for-profit sector. So another thing that might be worth underscoring is that, like you social scientists, our research might be sort of purely conceptual or theoretical. Now, when I say conceptual theoretical, I don't necessarily mean theoretical proofs, not necessarily mathematical proofs, but developing new theories, or I might say in common vernacular, ideas about kind of how things work. It is most often, I would say, empirical, which is not really what I'm presenting here today. I'm presenting some theory with some case illustrations, but not a full-blown empirical study. And again, I am more of a macro-level researcher, so empirical for me means large N, maybe not as large N as the economist, but large-ish N, as opposed to more micro-level research. But another thing that might be a little bit different about business school social science research than maybe other social science research is we care greatly about the connection to practice and policy. So even when we're doing our conceptual or theoretical work, our empirical studies, we always have in the back of our mind, what does this mean for business organizations or governments or policy analysis? And I'm not saying sociologists and others don't think about that, but I would say for us, it's almost always front and center. It's almost always part of our points of reference, if you will. And I have tried to kind of divide my time between these three triangles. So I really, if I had 3 feet, I would have one in each of those corners. And I hope you'll see in what I'm presenting today, there's a little bit of each of those. There's a little bit of each of those there. Where does this paper fit in? Fits in pretty much right in the center here. Fits in pretty much right in this overlap of these Venn diagrams. Any questions about that? Again, I don't mean to be schooling everybody about my research or business school research, but again, for those of you not coming from maybe where we're coming from, I thought it might be useful spending a few minutes on it. Okay, so I've been interested, as I said, in what we used to call corporate social responsibility or corporate responsibility. Now I would say the term sustainability is more frequently used, but I still use them both. And as I said, one of the focuses of my research has been examining these cross-sectoral collaborations between and among business firms and NGOs, particularly environmental sector. So this paper builds somewhat on that tradition. I had a book a couple years ago with Michael Yazigi that actually looked at NGOs and corporations, both conflictual relationships, antagonistic relationships, and cooperative relationships. It's called NGOs and Corporations, Cooperation and Collaboration. So the context with which I'm entering this discussion here is thinking about the current state of affairs with regard to sustainability, and it's not a very pretty sight. I've been reading the book Sapiens. Have any of you read Sapiens, a New York Times bestseller? Really interesting. And one of the things that it has taught me is that the transformation of our physical and geographic environment is not a new thing. This has been going on for literally thousands of years. And so a lot of the concern that we hear expressed about what's been happening in the last, say, 4 or 5 decades really has a long, long history. So I don't think I need to convince you that environmental issues, especially climate change, but other environmental issues, are really posing a lot of challenges for human survival and flourishing. And a lot of the attention has now shifted, for better or for worse, from climate change mitigation, trying to slow down or stop climate change, to adaptation. So how do we as humans adapt to a physical environment that is changing? And so what we try to do in this paper is think about ways that those cross-sectoral collaborations might be able to be leveraged to address adaptation to these so-called grand challenges. And again, climate change is our particular point of reference, but potentially other global changes as well. So what we do here, among other things, is we bring together and integrate 2 relatively nascent literatures in management. One, a literature on environmental entrepreneurship, which is really only maybe 6 or 8 years old, but I think is starting to become well developed. Environmental entrepreneurship has been defined as the process of discovering, evaluating, and exploiting economic opportunities that are present in environmentally related market failures. So again, for you economists, you know what market failures are. So when the nature of our economy does not account for the costs and prices of the externalities associated with certain types of activities, the idea here is businesses can come in and provide sort of a solution or a response. So, we might think of like Tesla is an example. Maybe it's not the best example right now. And there are many, many, many others. So as I said, my point of reference is really this notion of cross-sectoral partnerships. So collaborations, alliances, joint ventures, if you will, between and among organizations from different sectors. So we're really kind of drawing upon and integrating these two literatures. And one of our contributions is to develop and introduce a new construct which we call collective environmental entrepreneurship, which is literally the merging or the integration of those two ideas that I just shared with you. So, and again, you can imagine how many rounds of review we went through to kind of finalize this, but you can read it, the process through which business, government, and NGOs work as partners to leverage and combine their sector-specific competencies to discover, develop, and scale innovative adaptive responses to environmental challenges. So this is the kind of the construct that we're introducing in this paper. So these grand societal challenges, of which our focus is really climate change, but there are others, loss of biodiversity, water shortages, human displacement associated with migration, et cetera, have severe local consequences, but those consequences from a public policy point of view are complex. One of the reasons they're complex is they occur at multiple levels. So any significant disruption associated with in the environment or another type of grand challenge naturally involves, say, governmental actors at the local level, at the regional level, at the national level. That's just but one of many aspects of their complexity. And so what we do in the paper is we evaluate why any single sector solution is perhaps not only insufficient for adapting to these grand challenges, but may actually be maladaptive. And I'm not going to walk you through all of this. In fact, I think I'll just focus on one example. And that's the example in the upper right corner. So ski resorts. One of my co-authors is actually an expert on sustainability in ski resorts. And what do ski resorts do when there's either less snow or uneven snow? They use more water to make snow. So that is certainly a logical adaptation to climate change on their part. But in our view, it is maladaptive because they're aggravating another problem by solving the first problem. So they're using more water, and water is already becoming scarce, to make snow because the snow that they would be receiving naturally is not sufficient or it is unpredictable. And so we go through and essentially evaluate and critique why the kinds of challenges that we're focused on are not fully addressable by any one of these sectors, So we're making the case that these issues naturally lend themselves to cross-sectoral solutions that involve some combination of business, governments, and NGOs. And again, feel free to stop me at any point and jump in. So what is it that these three sectors bring to the table with regard to these grand challenges, and again, especially environmental challenges? So among other things, the private sector can bring financial resources, market intelligence, expertise, innovation. And again, we're especially concerned about innovation here because we're interested in really new entrepreneurial solutions, not kind of the same old solutions. Governments provide the institutional framework, authority, and public legitimacy, et cetera. Governments and NGOs, again, especially in the environmental realm, bring scientific and technical expertise resulting from their experience managing large-scale problems that transcend governmental spheres of influence. So the way that environmental NGOs think about regions is not by political boundaries, but by watersheds and ecosystems and other kinds of natural, physical boundaries that transcend the governmental boundaries. Christopher. No, I think that that's one of the considerations. But I think, as it turns out, governments are maybe even slower moving than we had expected. So if you take like the Paris Climate Accord, they're sort of moving along at, I would say, a pretty, modest pace. And so we're interested in quicker, speedier, more responsive solutions that help adapt stakeholders to these challenges, while maybe we're sitting back and waiting for governments to do something more material and significant in the longer term. So yes, I could see some examples of that, but my own sense right now is that that is not as much of a driver as maybe we had thought it was going to be. One example would be, in Europe, there were pretty significant subsidies for a number of years for alternative energy, and because of financial constraints, those subsidies have been rolled back, as our subsidies have been here as well. So those of you that got a tax break when you bought what did you buy? Yeah, solar panels, but also when you bought your car. When you bought your car, those are starting to go away as well. So it's a good point. I think in theory, yes, but in practice, not so much. Okay, so this is kind of our basic model here. So we start down here with some kind of initial formation of a consortium, if you will, among a private, public, and not-for-profit actors. They establish a partnership. But as you'll see in a moment, we're very concerned about whether they can establish and identify functional governance. By governance, I mean sort of how do they arrange their supervision and the authority that's going to drive this partnership. Because these three sectors have very different missions and cultures and kind of orientations. And this is really the main focus of the latter part of the paper. They bring together their knowledge, their combinative capabilities to apply to some challenge, again, climate change or something else. They pool resources and generate these adaptation responses. They pilot them, learn from their failures, and then try to scale up. So that's kind of the basic flow model that we think about. And again, this is based on our own observations of these partnerships. It's not something we just, made up in the back room someday. But any questions about that? I'm going to conclude with 3 concrete examples, if that's okay with you. Yeah. So I mentioned that the governance challenge has been one of the things that's really held back these cross-sectoral collaborations. It's not unlike a joint venture in that a business firm and a government and NGO have their own day-to-day pressures, responsibilities, priorities, et cetera. So when they come together to do something new and different from what they've been doing in the past, it, first of all, doesn't always command their highest priority. They may not put their sort of best people on it. When push comes to shove and budgets are short, they may withdraw from it. So getting a sustainable, scalable governance system, we think, is the key to the success or failure of these cross-sectoral collaboration. More specifically, we think about goal conflicts. We identify 3 sets of goal conflicts between and among these organizations from these 3 sectors. And again, I'm going to describe these in a moment. But they are the focus, which is essentially what they care most about, scale, so how do they think about the depth and breadth of these projects, and then time horizon. How focused are they on the very near term, the moderate term, versus the longer term? And what we've observed is these goal conflicts tend to be the source of failure in these cross-sectoral collaborations. And if these goal conflicts can be resolved, if there are strategies and techniques to resolve those goal conflicts, then there's a greater likelihood that these initiatives will scale and will become sustainable. So this is kind of just our model in terms of sort of resolving these conflicts and creating a successful outcome. And all I really want you to focus on here is this bottom category. So when we looked at the literature that addressed different types of conflicts among cross-sectoral partnerships, these were the problems that were identified. And what we found that those problems were really smaller scale, more marginal, more incremental, and the ones that we identified more fundamental. And so we tried to develop ideas around, well, what could resolve those conflicts? What could resolve those focus, scale, and time horizon conflict? And we came up with sort of 3 ideas. And the focus conflict arises primarily because business organizations, quite naturally, tend to be very economically and financially motivated. So if there's not a clear payoff, or if there's not a clear way to value, in an economic sense, what this activity is focused on, then their interest level and their attention is going to be less than it might otherwise be. And John, I'm looking at you here. We argue that ecosystem valuation mechanisms, also called ecosystem services in the biology vernacular, or green infrastructure, is a way to resolve this focus conflict. And to put this simplistically, this is simply assigning a dollar value to the benefit something in the environment provides to humans. So, John, to make this a little interactive, what would be an example of ecosystem services? So something in the environment that provides and generates value to humans. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So we might have a tendency to ignore a water system because we're not getting maybe water from it directly. Others are polluting it. But when we start to value that water and the clean water that it ultimately brings to humans, then we can provide a more economic justification to either limit that pollution or have that polluter pay, if you will, pay a tax. And again, I'm going to show an example of this. This is the only one that I think is really kind of complicated. And this derives really from, I'm just trying to remember what I have next here. I'm going to go through these propositions. This is maybe an easier way to do it. So ecosystem valuation mechanism help mitigate focus conflict by doing what? Showing that there are ways of valuing ecosystems, of valuing aspects of the physical environment that may make private sector interests more compelled and more committed and more motivated to take part in these collaborations. Those of you who are students of Elinor Ostrom will recognize this concept, and so we're arguing that polycentric governance, which are governance systems that allow for information flow among different levels, so say national, regional, and local, help mitigate these scale conflicts, because they create accountability change. They create accountability opportunities for those at sort of the most micro level to be accountable to those at the mid-level and vice versa. And again, Ostrom has some really, I think, interesting work describing how these work in preserving what she calls common goods resources. So resources that are shared by different communities that need to be well taken care of and stewarded, but there aren't natural incentives for doing so. And then finally, we think risk-sharing contractual mechanisms can help mitigate these time horizon conflicts. So when we think about things that we do in the short term and the consequences in the long term, if we link them contractually, it may create better decisions in the short term, better incentives to do the right thing in the first instance, as opposed to clean it up, if you will, down the road. So, to your question, Diego. So here's three illustrations, if you will, that we think nicely represent those three solutions to these goal conflicts. The first is something called a water fund. Now, John, I know you know what a water fund is, but does anybody else in the room know what a water fund is? I only know because my wife taught me, to be honest with you. But it's a really interesting, it's a really interesting and creative mechanism. And the premise is the following, that if we could provide financial incentives for upstream users of water, say farmers or industrial users or communities, to keep the water clean in the first instance, then we wouldn't spend all that money cleaning it up downstream. In addition to this example, one of the most successful examples is actually the New York City Water Authority, that pays farmers and others in the Hudson Valley not to mess up the water so that they don't then have to use chemicals and other things to clean it up subsequently. So it's really the idea of preempting the problem as opposed to cleaning it up after the fact. This Bogota Water Authority is, I think, one of the largest and most successful of these water funds. And again, it works essentially as I just described to you. There are financial incentives, payments, if you will, to upstream users of water or industrial and farming activities that then have consequences for the water, so that downstream the users of the water, typically a municipal water authority, doesn't have to clean it up after the fact. And again, the essential point is assigning financial value to that upstream activity. So the only way this works is to say it is worth X number of dollars to pay these people not to do what they might otherwise do, and really think about it in an economic and financial way as opposed to just a regulatory approach. So I am going to pause here and see if you have questions about any of these, because I think this is really where the rubber hits the road. Eric. Mm-hmm. Ah, that's interesting. Yeah, that's interesting. Um, it's a great question, and I think the best way for me to answer it is to observe that many environmental NGOs themselves, including the one that my wife works for, Conservation International, have already begun shifting the conversation from a pure mitigation or prevention orientation to an adaptation orientation. I'm not saying they've given up, but I think they've recognized that even under the best scenario, we are going to experience climate change for the remainder of our lifetimes and probably our children's lifetime, and unless something radical changes, an asteroid hits the planet or something. And so it only makes sense. It only makes sense to help humans adapt their lifestyles and their living practices and where they live and how they use water to that reality. But it's an interesting question because if these kinds of initiatives made everybody more comfortable with climate change and they're like, no big deal, then that would also be a maladaptive response, wouldn't it be? That wouldn't be a productive thing. It's a good question. Diego. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yep. It's again another great question. My experience in kind of energy environmental economics is that a pure regulatory approach can be very effective when there is high understanding and information about the ultimate goal, and that all stakeholders are going to be able to meet whatever that regulatory level would be. Because what sometimes happens is the ideal level of, say, a pollutant is somewhere in between the worst and the best polluter. And so you're sort of asking more from the worst polluter than they may be able to contribute. You're really asking nothing from the least polluter. So they can be kind of crude and not as precise. And this is why we have things like cap and trade, because you have surplus pollution, if you will, over here, and you've got a shortage over there, and cap and trade allows sort of for that, I would say, more efficient approach. And I think this approach does that same sort of thing. The other thing that this approach may do is bring together the geographic and psychic distance between these two sets of stakeholders who are otherwise completely separate and apart in terms of their sort of priorities and orientations. So you're, in a sense, reducing an information asymmetry that occurs because of lack of geographic, proximity, and maybe creating, positive incentives as opposed to negative incentives. But, to answer your question, I don't know. It's possible that if this water authority simply slapped a big tax on the polluters or established a regulation that you could accomplish something similarly. Again, we would argue that there are potential benefits and innovations that allow for maybe a more rapid and a more successful outcome than trying to find the ideal sort of regulatory. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so the only thing that I would add is that this system allows for real-time adjustment of those financial incentives. So if in the first instance, month number 1, the level of decrease in pollutants is not sufficient, that tax, that financial payment, not tax, it's a positive payment, can be adjusted. So I think this is a very dynamic approach as opposed to a more static approach, and I think that also may have advantages. And we would say that that's innovative, and that's something the private sector participation can help facilitate. But it's a fair question. It's a fair question. So that's INAV. That's the ecosystem valuation. So, yes, please. Yes, and I think the other reality here is that property rights may not be as well defined as we would like, especially if you think about like what De Soto has written about Latin America. Maybe we don't have as clear-cut property rights, and the legal system, talk about slow, is likely to be among the slowest solutions or resolutions, especially in this context. So I would say yes. I would say yes. Yep. True, 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 true. So this... Mm-hmm. So again, in response to Eric's question, many of them, for better or worse, have come around to this. They have come around to this. Not, well, maybe. I was going to say not Greenpeace, but I'm not sure about Greenpeace. But Greenpeace has moderated a lot as well. The big 3 global environmental conservation groups, World Wildlife Fund, the Nature Conservancy, Conservation International, are all involved in some of these kinds of activities. But I think where I thought you started to go with your question leads me to the second point, and that's related to how do you get governments at different levels sort of working together. And again, we're drawing on Elinor Ostrom's work that focuses not so much on which government has the authority, but which government is sort of most well-equipped to contribute that particular solution or that particular contribution. You might think about this, you political scientists, like the concept of subsidiarity in political science, which is that you sort of push things down to the lowest level of government that's efficient in sort of implementing the outcome, but you create these information chains, these information flows between and among different levels of government. And again, here we're using the example of Adapt CC2 Carbon Fix, which is an initiative, again, among public and private actors trying to preserve land for purposes of coffee production and other kinds of agricultural activities. And again, the key point here is that these farmers, who are very sort of at the micro level, are linked with this partnership so that the carbon credit incentives are quite material to them and evident to them in this development of the standard program. And again, this is like a global standard for agriculture. So let me go to the last one, which is, to me, the most interesting, and I think the most innovative, and frankly, the one I know most about, because I did a fairly in-depth case study with some colleagues on this particular collaboration. So it's called Harita, which is not a very nice acronym, but it stands for the Horn of Africa Risk Transfer for Adaptation project. And it was an initiative of Oxfam USA, you know, a division of the Global Poverty Relief Organization, and Swiss Re. Swiss Re, a big global reinsurer. And to me, what's interesting about this, among other things, is that insurance is not something that is self-evidently attractive to people who don't have prior exposure to it. I don't know if any of you have ever tried to explain insurance to your kids, but it's a little challenging, because you'll say, wait, you're going to pay for something not to happen in case it might happen. It's a funny concept, and it's not one that I think is just intuitive sort of in societies around the world. But what's happening in this part of Africa, which is true of other parts of the world, but is especially, I think, challenging, is a lot of unevenness in weather, a lot of reduction in overall rainfall, and more lack of predictability in rainfall. So farmers are facing seasons that don't look like seasons in the past in terms of when the rain comes and how much comes. And so if the rain doesn't come, they're really in trouble, and they're not able to have the crops that they would be expecting. And so this was a system of trying to introduce an insurance product. So get the farmers to ultimately pay a little bit, so that in the event that they did experience a drought or a season where their weather and their rain was very uneven, that they would be compensated, just like we would have here in the US with farmers insurance. The problem was, because insurance was not so intuitively obvious, the organizers of this collaboration had to create kind of an artificial payout. So the farmers could see and have an example of getting a payment during a period where they were not experiencing the rain and the weather that they would like. And initially, they didn't pay money, but they paid in labor. And they paid by investing their labor in different types of activities that would help mitigate climate change in their community, like planting trees and creating irrigation systems, et cetera. And this partnership has been quite successful. Literally thousands of farmers are now benefiting from it. And Oxfam and a bunch of other partners, the World Food Program, Swiss Re, are now rolling it out to other parts of Africa. And to me, this is, as I said, I think among the most innovative and the most interesting of these examples, because you're taking sort of a real first world idea, insurance, and adapting it to the needs and the particular context of this local situation. Just as an aside, another interesting thing about this partnership, unrelated to this project, is that Oxfam is a NGO that is historically very skeptical of collaborations with the private sector. In fact, if you were to follow Oxfam over the years, you would see that they are quite aggressive in their advocacy. They have campaigns and boycotts and all kinds of things. And so one condition that Oxfam introduced in the contract that governs this collaboration is that they would still have the right to protest, boycott, and otherwise criticize, like Swiss Re or anybody else, because they didn't want to feel hamstrung. They didn't want to feel constrained because they are sort of buying into this partnership, where Swiss Re is naturally investing resources. So this now, as I said, this pilot, and remember I talked about pilots before and testing and learning from mistakes, is being rolled out in other African countries. So to wrap up, as I said at the beginning, this is what we'd call a theory development or theory to practice exercise, where we're developing some ideas, some intuitions based on the literature, based on our conceptual and theoretical understandings, and applying them in a particular context. In this case, cross-sectoral collaboration, but more specifically, cross-sectoral collaboration that is addressing adaptation to grand challenges, generally climate change in particular. So we talked a little bit about what this concept of collective environmental entrepreneurship is. We talked about goal conflicts as the real constraint or the challenge that these cross-sectoral collaborations face, because they have different missions and cultures and histories and priorities and leadership, and even professional classes. So like historically in environmental NGOs, you'd have a lot of lawyers and scientists. You don't have a lot of people that are coming from the business world. That's changing. And then we talked about these governance mechanisms that help solve or resolve those goal conflicts. And I provided a couple examples of each of those at work. So let me stop now and see what other questions you have. We were scheduled to wrap up around 2:15. We're right at 2:15. But I'd love to take a question, too, or comment from anybody else. John? Yeah. It is both horizontal and vertical. So remember I said earlier that the way that like environmental NGOs think about regions is not with respect to political boundaries. So most of these problems are transcending traditional political boundaries, be they at the local level, national level, or take the Rio Grande River would be an example in our own area. So how do you get political actors from at different levels and from different jurisdictions, to work together? And what Ostrom talked about was creating these information chains. I know this sounds fairly esoteric and abstract, but let me try to be more concrete. Specific mechanisms for information sharing between and among actors or stakeholders, both horizontally and vertically. So to put it really practically, things that are going on at the micro level are communicated up to the macro level. Things that are going on the Mexican side of the border are communicated to things going on the Texas side of the border. So to create explicit information chains or channels to help resolve this problem, but also to create a collective approach to a problem as opposed to different government actors kind of doing their own thing. Does that make a little bit more sense? Yeah. Yes. Yes. Yeah.
Organic in the sense of, putting it together, and it's an entity that's part of a bigger, each of the members are doing other things, or is it become an entity of itself, and really it's both?
Let me give you even more practical example. So in the US, we've had a lot of problems with overlapping governmental jurisdictions, and so some regions have created this kind of regional authority that it sits over the individual cities and towns. It doesn't replace them or supplant them, but it creates a structure for them to work more collaboratively together. That would be an example of polycentric governance in Osborne. Exactly. Yes, Tina. Yeah, so two things. One, I totally agree with both of you that a catalyst is needed. It's not as if this is going to just, naturally emanate, up from the grassroots on its own. So there needs to be some kind of catalyst. When we talk about scaling, we're not really talking about global scaling. We're talking about scaling sort of within a region, taking something that's very local and maybe making it regional. So let me talk quickly first about what we're thinking about as scaling, and then I'll give you just one idea about global scaling. So what we were thinking and the kinds of catalysts that we've observed would be like an NGO coming in to this Bogota Water Authority and saying, have you thought about another way of dealing with your dirty water problem? Because we have some examples from other parts of the world, like Hudson Valley, New York City, that have shown to be more effective and cheaper than what you're doing. Would you be open to that? Then they might get a grant from a foundation. Then they might try it out at a micro level. And then as we showed in the flow diagram, sort of scale it up. So I think, often a third party like an NGO can be a catalyst. And again, the Nature Conservancy is the organization that's been especially active with these water funds around the world. And depending how we're counting, they count a couple hundred of them. So not inconsequential. But in terms of global scaling, I'm thinking of like this Climate Change Cities initiative that Mike Bloomberg and other people are working on, which is sort of comparing and sharing best practices among municipalities globally. I think is it the mayor of Paris and Bloomberg that are heading it up? Yeah. So I think that's another way, convening interested parties from different parts of the world that have something to share. Again, that's not what we're talking about here, but I do see some evidence of that. And that gets back to your question, Christopher, is sort of what do we do while the governments are not doing anything? There's a lot of activity, both in the private sector and the public sector. Yes, Manny. So that's a question I used to get a lot, and I know that you, coming from the international aid world, have also faced that question. And just to maybe make it a more generalized question, some people are concerned that if you have foundations like the Gates Foundation or big NGOs like the Nature Conservancy coming in and addressing problems that governments really should be addressing, that it effectively lets the government off the hook, that essentially you're excusing the authority who should really be responsible for the problem. And Manny, I don't lie awake a lot at night thinking about that, because it's one of those thought experiments. What if? We don't know what the governments would or would not do absent that intervention. And so I tend to observe that governments are under a lot of pressure. They're under a lot of fiscal pressure. Most are running deficits. Look at municipalities in the US who have these retirement obligations that are going to bankrupt them by 2020. I think there's a real problem of resource constraint in governments. And if in one instance maybe a government doesn't do something that maybe it would have done otherwise, to me that's a fair price to say, hey, we really need the private sector and NGOs to come in here and do some of this stuff, because the governments either aren't able or aren't willing. So I kind of duck that question in my research, because I just think that broadly speaking, the need is so great and government coffers are so stressed that I welcome private and not-for-profit entrance into what we used to call public goods or social goods. Jeremy. Yeah, I think I'm just going to talk about one, but it's one that has occupied me and several others, and it's the dynamic or longitudinal nature of these partnerships. So implicit in my discussion here was, one, that they don't happen naturally. There needs to be a catalyst, or there needs to be agency on the part of at least one of these actors. And two, because organizations from these three sectors are always going to have their own higher priorities, it's hard to keep these things going. And it's even harder to scale them. So then the question becomes, what are the ingredients, if you will, that create a positive virtuous circle, like a dynamic process that not only grows and scales these, but makes them more sustainable, versus, frankly, many of them that just kind of, shrivel up. And that kind of research could be done at the micro level, where you're actually looking at individuals from a negotiation point of view, or from a relational capital point of view. And it could also be more at the organizational level, where you think about structural features in the organizations that make them more open, willing, and successful in these kinds of partnerships versus those that maybe are not so successful. So that's what I spend a fair amount of my time on. And there are many others, maybe a dozen others who are also looking at that problem. Because if we look 20 years ago, a lot of these were kind of one-offs. So Corporation X is getting a lot of criticism from its stakeholders, and it thinks, I got to do something here, so I'm going to go find an NGO to partner with, and that's going to help kind of let me off the hook. Or the NGO says, wow, we really need some resources, some private sector expertise or whatever. These are starting to become longer term, more meaningful, more, dare I say, permanent. And that's a real change. That's a real change. And so that I think is one exciting part of this. Diego. How about you start with one? And you've got 50 other impatient people here. He may not want to stay around for the answer too. Keep that in mind. The sun is shining. I'm glad you asked that question. I'm so glad. No, I don't want to cross it off. I want to talk about it.
Okay, you want to talk about research. Okay. But is the science research, are there other ways that you can grow the process of or other universities that we can contribute to
So let me address the question as I would like to interpret it. Universities are ideal places and mechanisms for organizations from these different sectors to come together in a safe space and explore the kinds of collaborations that I'm describing here. That could be like research-based, it could be like live cases, it could be longitudinal, but I think, you know, universities, let's remember, are also not-for-profits, right? They also fall into this category of not-for-profit communities. And I think more specifically, if we are committed to universities as not just places of intellectual engagement, but places of intellectual engagement that actually really matters to society, then we are actually well positioned to bring together stakeholders to have these conversations and to explore these collaborations. So I think we should do more of it. And in my role at VSB, one of the themes that I've tried to advance with Joyce's encouragement is research impact, thinking about how our research can and does have real-world impact. And this paper, whether you love it or hate it, has gotten some traction. It's gotten some traction, and not just among academics. Tina's done some very interesting work in sustainability that has gotten some traction among policymakers and practitioners. So I think we're well suited, and we are also under a little bit of pressure to show how what we do really matters. And so I'm glad you asked that question. And I know I'm answering it very generally, but I think it's a general point that would. Yeah. Exactly. Thank you for finishing the thought. Mhm. Yep. Yep. Yeah, that's true. No, I mean, I think you're right. I guess, I tend to be very satisfied with like half a loaf. I tend to be pretty, well, yeah, exactly. And I think about academics and our public engagement, let's just put it that way. And I think everybody in this room has something important and meaningful to say to people out there. It's just to try to provide the small incentives to get you all to say that. And I don't think that's rocket science. I think that's, we have to have incentives, of course, but I'm not sure those incentives require sort of massive, massive spending. In other words, I think much of the research we're doing does matter. I just think we don't take that last step to kind of translate it and present it and broadcast it and, dare I say, market it. I think I'm available to you all afternoon until the president of Southwest shows up. But I think this would be a natural place for us to finish up, and we can, for those of you who want to stay around and have a chat, we can continue to have a chat. But thank you all for coming. Thank you for your time and attention. Thank you for your engagement.